Welcome to Still Science Lab. Tonight, we are going to dismantle the most fundamental, comforting illusion you have ever experienced. And we are going to explore a phenomenon so deeply unsettling that it caused the greatest physicists of the 20th century to question the very fabric of reality itself. We are going to look past the physical, biological boundaries of the world you see around you, step into the deepest mysteries of the subatomic realm, and ask the ultimate, haunting question at the center of our investigation: quantum non-locality. Does the soul exist outside of space? To begin to understand the sheer magnitude of this cosmic paradox, you must first critically examine the way you perceive your own existence within the universe. From the exact moment you are born, your biological senses are ruthlessly trained to understand and respect the tyrant of distance. You instinctively know that the world is a vast, physical grid. To interact with an object, to touch a surface, or to communicate with another human being, you must physically cross the spatial gap that separates you. If you drop a stone into a quiet pond, you watch the ripples travel outward, moving step by step, inch by inch, through the medium of the water. Nothing happens instantly. Every single action, every transfer of energy, and every exchange of information in the macroscopic world is fundamentally constrained by the ironclad rules of physical space and the unyielding progression of time. This concept, known as local realism, is the foundational bedrock of our daily lives. It is the intuitive, common-sense belief that an object can only be directly influenced by its immediate physical surroundings. Even when we look up at the night sky and expand our perspective to the terrifying scale of the cosmos, this rule seems absolute. Albert Einstein codified this limitation into the ultimate law of the universe, proving that absolutely nothing, not a physical object, not a wave of radiation, and not a single bit of information can ever travel faster than the speed of light in a vacuum. The speed of light is the absolute, unbreakable speed limit of physical reality. Because of this limitation, the universe is a profoundly isolated and disconnected place. When we look through our most powerful telescopes at a galaxy situated 10 billion light-years away, we are not seeing that galaxy as it exists right now. We are looking at ancient history, receiving a faint, delayed signal that has spent 10 billion years agonizingly crawling across the vast, freezing, and unimaginably empty abyss of intergalactic space. The cosmos is entirely defined by separation, a sprawling void where distance is the ultimate, insurmountable barrier. But now, I want you to imagine completely shattering that barrier. I want you to imagine taking two tiny, fundamental subatomic particles, perhaps 2 electrons, or 2 photons of light. In the highly controlled, isolated environment of a quantum laboratory, you force these two particles to deeply interact, causing their individual quantum states to merge and intertwine. They become what physicists call entangled. Once this profound subatomic marriage has occurred, you take these two entangled particles and you separate them. You leave one particle trapped in a magnetic containment field here on Earth, sitting quietly in a dark laboratory. You take the second particle and you somehow transport it across the entire observable universe. You carry it past the swirling arms of the Milky Way, beyond the towering pillars of cosmic dust, and you place it on the darkest, most distant edge of existence, billions of light-years away from our solar system. According to everything we understand about classical physics, general relativity, and the common-sense rules of our 3D reality, these two particles are now completely and hopelessly divorced. They are separated by a gulf of space so unimaginably vast that a signal traveling at the absolute maximum speed of light would take billions of years to cross the divide. They should be entirely isolated entities, deaf and blind to one another. And then you do something impossible. You reach out and you physically interact with the particle remaining here on Earth. You stimulate it, you measure its quantum spin, or you effectively tickle it, forcing its chaotic, shifting wave of probabilities to collapse into a single, definitive state. In that exact, infinitesimal fraction of a yoctosecond, the entangled twin particle resting on the opposite side of the observable universe, billions of light years away, flinches. It instantly, simultaneously, and perfectly reacts to the measurement made on Earth, immediately adopting the corresponding quantum state. It does not react a billion years later when a signal of light finally reaches it. It does not react a second later. It reacts instantly. The communication between the two particles occurs faster than the speed of light. It occurs faster than the fundamental fabric of reality should logically allow. This is not a theoretical thought experiment from a science fiction novel. This is a rigorously tested, undeniable, and mathematically proven feature of our physical universe. It is known as quantum non-locality, and it stands as the definitive, undeniable proof that the physical space we inhabit is not what we think it is. When two particles become entangled, they do not secretly whisper to each other across the cosmic void using invisible radio waves or undiscovered, faster-than-light signals. They do not communicate at all. They react instantly because, in the deep, hidden mathematics of the quantum realm, they are no longer two separate, isolated objects. They share a single, unified quantum identity. Despite the billions of miles of cold, dark vacuum that supposedly lie between them in the physical world, they are effectively occupying the exact same point in reality. For the entangled particles, the vast expanse of the cosmos simply does not exist. The distance between them is mathematically zero. This experimentally verified phenomenon forces humanity to confront a terrifying, reality-breaking paradox. If two physical objects can be fundamentally, deeply one, while physically separated by the entire width of the observable universe, what does that say about the nature of our world? It suggests that distance is a localized illusion, a macroscopic trick played on our biological senses. It implies that the three-dimensional grid of space that we navigate every single day is not the absolute foundational layer of reality, but rather a shallow interface, a holographic projection masking a much deeper, entirely spaceless dimension. If non-locality is the true underlying rule of the cosmos, then the very concept of here and there begins to violently dissolve. Everywhere is simultaneously right here, and everything is intimately, instantly connected through a hidden architectural layer of the void where physical boundaries have absolutely no meaning. If the foundational building blocks of our universe can exist in a state that completely ignores the boundaries of physical space, we are inevitably forced to turn our gaze inward. We must look away from the freezing edges of the galaxy and stare directly into the dense, wet, and incredibly complex machinery of the human brain. We must ask a question that bridges the terrifying gap between hard quantum mechanics and ancient existential philosophy. Your brain, the organic supercomputer currently processing these words, is not a magical artifact. It is constructed from billions of atoms, and those atoms are built from the exact same fundamental subatomic particles that exhibit this reality-breaking, non-local behavior in our laboratories. You are made of quantum material. Tonight, we investigate the most haunting and profound implication of this quantum glitch ever conceived. If physical matter and subatomic information can maintain a deep, instantaneous connection that exists entirely outside the framework of physical space. What happens to the complex, firing web of information that constitutes your identity, your memories, and your continuous waking awareness? If the underlying code of reality is perfectly capable of bypassing the physical dimensions, does the human soul, the seat of our consciousness and the essence of who we are, actually reside in a realm that physical death cannot touch? We are going to explore the terrifying, scientifically grounded possibility that your mind is not simply a biological byproduct generated by the decaying flesh inside your skull. We will investigate the theory that your brain is not a generator of consciousness, but rather an incredibly complex, biological antenna tuned to receive a signal from a non-local quantum field. We will strip away the comforting illusion of distance, confront the mathematical death of local reality, and track the ghost of human consciousness into the deepest mechanics of the cosmos. We will determine if the essence of your existence is trapped in the physical world, doomed to dissolve with your biology, or if your mind is an eternal, non-local phenomenon, hovering in the infinite dark where time and space have absolutely no power. To fully appreciate the terrifying implications of a universe where distance is an illusion, we must examine the fierce, intellectual war waged against this very concept by the greatest scientific mind of the 20th century. The realization that two subatomic particles could bypass the vast, physical expanse of the cosmos to communicate instantly did not emerge as a celebrated triumph of human understanding. It was born as a nightmare. It was a theoretical monster, intentionally dragged out of the mathematical shadows by Albert Einstein, not to prove that the universe was magical, but to definitively prove that the newly established field of quantum mechanics was fundamentally, hopelessly flawed. To understand the depth of Einstein's horror, we must first understand the pristine, logical cathedral of physics he had spent his entire life constructing. By 1935, Einstein was the undisputed architect of reality. He had successfully mapped the macrocosm, proving that gravity was not a mysterious, invisible tether, but rather the literal warping and curving of the physical fabric of space and time. He had established the absolute, unbreakable speed limit of the cosmos, the speed of light dictating that no object, no wave of radiation, and no signal of information could ever travel faster than roughly 186,000 miles per second. This speed limit was not just a mathematical curiosity, it was the ultimate, tyrannical enforcer of a concept known as local realism. Local realism is the profound, common-sense philosophical and physical foundation upon which our entire understanding of reality is built. It consists of two unbreakable pillars. First, realism, the belief that the universe exists in a definite, objective state, regardless of whether or not a human being is looking at it. The moon is still physically there in the dark sky, even if every human on Earth closes their eyes. Objects possess intrinsic, predetermined properties. Second, locality, the belief that an object can only be influenced by its immediate, physical surroundings. If an event occurs, its effects can only ripple outward through space at the speed of light, like a wave moving through a physical ocean. You cannot affect a star situated millions of light years away without first waiting millions of years for your signal to cross the vast, physical abyss. The universe, according to Einstein, was a sane, predictable, and rigidly structured clockwork machine. Causes must precede effects locally, and the cosmic speed limit ensures that the universe remains a collection of isolated, independent events. But as Einstein perfected his beautiful deterministic model of the cosmos, a darker, far more chaotic branch of physics was rapidly rising to prominence. A brilliant, radical group of physicists, led by Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg, had descended into the microscopic abyss of the atom and returned with a theory that completely shattered the clockwork universe. They built the framework of quantum mechanics, a mathematical system that suggested the fundamental building blocks of reality were not solid, predictable objects, but rather shifting, blurry clouds of probability. According to the quantum camp, a particle like an electron did not actually exist in a specific physical location until the exact moment a scientist forced it into reality by measuring it. Before measurement, the electron was essentially everywhere and nowhere at once, existing only as a mathematical wave of potential. Einstein absolutely despised this concept. He abhorred the idea that the universe was governed by random chance and probabilistic blurs, famously declaring that God does not play dice with the universe. He believed that the bizarre, blurry mathematics of quantum mechanics were merely a temporary symptom of human ignorance, a statistical approximation that simply lacked the deeper, underlying rules. To expose the fatal absurdity of this probabilistic nightmare, Einstein teamed up with two brilliant colleagues, Boris Podolsky and Nathan Rosen. In 1935, they published what would become one of the most famous and weaponized scientific papers in human history, creating a thought experiment now known as the EPR paradox. They did not build a machine. They used the pure, rigorous logic of mathematics to trap the quantum physicists in an impossible, reality-breaking contradiction. Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen took the established mathematics of quantum mechanics and followed them to their absolute logical extreme. They theorized a scenario where a single, unstable particle violently decays, splitting into two separate, twin particles that fly off in opposite directions. Because these two particles were born from the exact same event, their physical properties, such as their quantum spin, must perfectly balance each other out to conserve the fundamental laws of energy and momentum. If one particle is spinning upward, the other must inherently be spinning downward. The particles are intimately intertwined, sharing a single, unified mathematical state. They are entangled. The trap was elegantly simple. The EPR paper asked the scientific community to imagine allowing these two entangled particles to drift apart until they were separated by an immense distance. Perhaps one particle remains in a laboratory in Princeton, while the other travels to the freezing, dark edge of the Andromeda galaxy. According to the strict rules of Niels Bohr and the quantum camp, neither particle actually possesses a definitive, real direction of spin until the exact moment they are measured. They are both hovering in a blurry state of infinite possibilities. But, the EPR paper pointed out, if a scientist in Princeton finally measures the first particle and forces it to choose a state, let us say, spin up, they immediately, instantaneously know, with absolute 100% certainty, that the particle sitting in the Andromeda galaxy is entirely spin down. This is where Einstein dropped the hammer. How could the second particle, millions of light years away, instantly know to collapse its probability wave and adopt the exact opposite state of the first particle? There are only two possible explanations. The first explanation is that the act of measuring the particle on Earth somehow sent an invisible, instantaneous signal across the vast, empty void of intergalactic space, commanding the second particle to choose its state. But Einstein's own theory of relativity strictly forbade this. A signal traveling faster than the speed of light violates the absolute geometry of spacetime. Einstein vehemently mocked this idea, famously deriding it in German as spukhafte Fernwirkung, which translates to spooky action at a distance. To Einstein, the concept of invisible, Faster-than-light communication between two physical objects was nothing more than macabre, telepathic magic. It was a theoretical ghost story that had no place in serious science. Therefore, Einstein argued, because spooky action at a distance is a physical impossibility, the only logical, sane conclusion is the second explanation. The particles must have secretly known exactly what states they were going to be in from the very moment they split apart. They must carry some kind of hidden, internal blueprint, hidden variables that dictate their behavior in advance. This would mean that the particles were not actually hovering in a blurry state of probability, and that the universe was not random. It would mean that objects have real, pre-existing properties regardless of whether we measure them, and that local realism is preserved. Einstein proudly presented the EPR paradox as the ultimate, definitive proof that quantum mechanics was an incomplete theory. It was a flawed, shallow understanding of a much deeper, deterministic reality that humanity simply had not yet discovered. He believed he had successfully banished the quantum ghosts and restored sanity, order, and distance to the universe. For the remainder of his life, Einstein stood as the great, unyielding defender of local realism. As he aged, he became increasingly isolated from the mainstream physics community, stubbornly refusing to accept the chaotic, non-local implications of the quantum realm. He spent his final decades tirelessly searching for a unified field theory, desperately trying to construct a mathematical framework that would explain away the bizarre behavior of subatomic particles and prove that the universe was a rigid, objective grid where nothing could move faster than light. When Albert Einstein passed away in a hospital bed in 1955, he closed his eyes with the absolute, unshakable conviction that he was right. He died believing that the universe made sense, that distance was an absolute barrier, and that the spooky, instantaneous connection between separated objects was nothing more than a mathematical illusion caused by an incomplete theory. He was wrong. He was fundamentally, absolutely, and terrifyingly wrong. Einstein's nightmare was not a mathematical error. It was the actual, physical operating system of the cosmos. The great architect of space and time went to his grave entirely unaware that the rigorous thought experiment he had designed to destroy quantum mechanics would eventually become the very blueprint used to prove its most horrifying implications. The universe is not a sane, predictable clockwork machine. It does not respect the boundaries of physical space, and it is entirely capable of executing telepathic magic across the intergalactic void. The ghost story that Einstein so fiercely mocked is the true fabric of reality, setting the stage for a revelation that would permanently shatter the illusion of distance and force humanity to look for the soul outside the confines of the physical world. For nearly 3 decades, following the publication of the EPR paradox, the scientific community existed in a state of uncomfortable, willful ignorance. The terrifying questions raised by Albert Einstein regarding the true nature of reality and the absolute limits of physical space were largely swept under the rug. Physicists were far too busy building the modern world. They were utilizing the bizarre mathematics of quantum mechanics to split the atom, design the very first semiconductors, and construct the heavy foundations of the digital age. The equations worked perfectly, and the technology functioned exactly as predicted. So, the deep, philosophical nightmare of whether or not the universe was actually locally real was treated as a completely dead end. It was considered a question for aging philosophers, not serious experimental physicists, primarily because everyone in the scientific establishment believed it was physically impossible to test. How could humanity ever hope to build a machine capable of determining if a subatomic particle secretly possessed a hidden blueprint before it was measured, or if it was truly communicating instantaneously across the cosmic void? The debate seemed permanently locked in the realm of untestable thought experiments, a subatomic ghost story that could neither be definitively proven nor completely exorcised from the halls of science. But the universe does not keep its secrets forever, and the comforting illusion of our three-dimensional reality was about to be violently torn away by an unassuming, softly spoken Irish physicist working in the cold, concrete shadows of the CERN laboratories in Switzerland. In the 1960s, John Stuart Bell decided to stare directly into the philosophical abyss that Einstein had left behind. Bell was a deep, rigorous thinker who was profoundly bothered by the accepted quantum dogma of his time. He wanted to know if the solid, predictable world of local realism, the world of safe distances and absolute speed limits, was truly dead. Through an act of sheer, staggering mathematical genius, Bell achieved what the greatest minds of the previous generation thought was completely impossible. He dragged the ghostly, theoretical debate out of the philosophical realm and forced it into the cold, unforgiving light of experimental physics. He formulated a brilliant, undeniable mathematical proof that is now known simply as Bell's theorem. Bell realized that if Einstein was right, if the universe was locally real, and entangled particles simply carried hidden, predetermined instructions like a pair of identical twin brothers opening sealed envelopes, then there had to be a strict mathematical limit to how often their behavior would correlate when measured along different, completely random axes. There is a hard, statistical ceiling to how synchronized two independent objects can be if they are not actively communicating with one another. However, if the quantum physicists were right, and these particles were truly, deeply connected by some terrifying, non-local spookiness, they would be able to synchronize their states with a level of perfection that completely shattered that statistical ceiling. Bell drew a permanent line in the sand. He created an absolute mathematical boundary known as Bell's inequality. If experimental data stayed below the line, Einstein was right, and the universe was a sane, separated place. If the data crossed the line, our entire understanding of reality was fundamentally, irreversibly broken. It took years for human technology to catch up to the terrifying brilliance of Bell's mathematics. It wasn't until the 1970s, and culminating in a series of incredibly precise, Nobel Prize-winning experiments in the decades that followed, that physicists finally built the machines necessary to test the absolute nature of reality. They constructed elaborate, heavily shielded optical traps. They fired pairs of entangled photons, particles of pure light, in opposite directions across vast distances, sending them screaming down fiber optic cables to completely independent measuring stations. To ensure that absolutely no secret, light-speed signal could possibly travel between the two detectors to cheat the system, the measuring devices were designed to randomly switch their alignment in a microscopic fraction of a nanosecond, while the photons were still in mid-flight. The ultimate trap was perfectly set. The universe was violently forced to answer the ultimate question. When the massive streams of data were finally compiled by supercomputers and the statistical correlations were calculated, the scientific community braced for the impact. The results were undeniable, flawless, and utterly devastating. Bell's inequality was violated. The data did not just cross the mathematical line drawn by local realism, it utterly obliterated it. The entangled photons were correlating their behavior with a level of absolute perfection that proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that no hidden variables existed. Einstein's secret blueprints were a comforting fiction. The violation of Bell's theorem stands as one of the most profound, reality-breaking discoveries in the entire history of human civilization. It is the experimental, mathematical proof that the universe we inhabit is fundamentally not locally real. Let those words sink deeply into your consciousness. Local realism is dead. The intuitive idea that an object only exists in a specific state because of its immediate surroundings, and the ironclad belief that distance is an absolute barrier to physical interaction, are both scientifically proven illusions. When those two entangled photons reacted instantly to one another across the void, they were not sending a secret, faster-than-light radio signal. They were not communicating at all. Information did not travel across the physical space separating them, because to the particles themselves, that physical space simply does not exist. The chilling reality that Bell's theorem forces us to accept is that the two entangled particles are not two separate entities communicating from afar. They are the exact same entity. They are a single, unified quantum system that just happens to be manifesting in two different locations within our three-dimensional world. To truly understand this, you must radically alter your perception of the physical grid you live in. Imagine you are watching a beautifully rendered, three-dimensional video game on a flat, two-dimensional television screen. If you see two characters interacting on opposite sides of the screen, you know that they are not actually crossing the physical glass of the monitor to talk to one another. The screen is just a shallow, localized projection. The true reality of those characters exists entirely in the complex, hidden binary code processing inside the computer's hard drive, a place where the concept of the physical distance on the screen has absolutely no meaning whatsoever. Our universe operates on the exact same terrifying principle. The three-dimensional grid of space that we navigate every single day, the vast distances between stars, the freezing, empty void between planets, and the physical gap between your eyes and the screen you are watching right now is nothing more than a shallow surface. It is a holographic projection generated by a much deeper, vastly more complex underlying reality. In this higher dimensional realm, the fundamental code of the universe is perfectly entangled, completely undivided by the illusion of physical distance. The non-local glitch of quantum mechanics is not a mistake or a measurement error. It is the true, undivided architecture of the cosmos bleeding through the fragile, localized fabric of our 3D prison. We are living our entire lives on the superficial skin of a universe that is deeply, fundamentally interconnected in a dimension our biological eyes can never see. And if physical space is merely a projected illusion, a localized glitch in human perception, then the biological boundaries of your own mind are equally suspect. If distance is truly dead, we must begin to ask where the complex, entangled information that makes up your consciousness actually resides, and whether the destruction of your physical body on this 3D surface means anything at all to the underlying, eternal code of your soul. The realization that Bell's theorem mathematically dismantled the very foundation of local realism leaves humanity standing on the precipice of a terrifying conceptual abyss. If the universe actively allows two entangled particles to instantly mirror each other across billions of light years of cold, empty void, without a single physical signal ever crossing that expanse, we are violently forced to conclude that the abyss itself is a lie. Space, as we perceive it, is not a fundamental feature of reality. It is not the vast, silent, and empty container in which the drama of the cosmos plays out, separating the burning stars from the frozen planets. Instead, theoretical physics is increasingly pointing toward a chilling paradigm shift. The three-dimensional universe we inhabit is nothing more than a highly convincing, localized projection. We are trapped inside a perceptual prison, a biological construct specifically designed to hide the true underlying architecture of existence. To understand why we are imprisoned, we must look at the brutal, pragmatic nature of human evolution. Our brains were not engineered by nature to comprehend the infinite, overlapping complexities of quantum mechanics, nor were they wired to perceive the bizarre, non-local interconnectedness of the subatomic realm. Our sensory organs evolved strictly for survival on the harsh, macroscopic surface of a dangerous world. We needed to know exactly how far away a predator was hiding in the brush, how deep a physical chasm fell, and how fast a weapon was traveling through the air. Evolution forced our neurological wetware to construct a rigid, three-dimensional grid, a spatial interface that allows us to safely navigate and manipulate our immediate physical environment. We see distance because our ancestors needed the concept of distance to survive, but this evolutionary interface is a catastrophic distortion of the absolute truth. It has conditioned us to believe that physical separation is an absolute, unbreakable law of the cosmos. To shatter this deeply ingrained biological conditioning and truly visualize the hidden geometry of our reality, we must rely on a profound dimensional analogy. Imagine a completely flat, two-dimensional universe, much like the surface of a blank, white wall in a dark room. Now, imagine that living within the constraints of this flat wall are entirely two-dimensional beings. They have absolutely no concept of depth, no understanding of in or out, and no perception of up or down in the way we experience it. Their entire universe consists only of length and width. Suppose we take a complex, three-dimensional object, a rotating, intricately carved wooden cylinder, and we shine a powerful, multi-dimensional light upon it, casting its heavy shadow directly onto the two-dimensional wall. Because the object is complex and spinning, it casts two distinct, separate circular shadows on opposite sides of the flat surface. To the flat, two-dimensional scientists living within that wall, these two shadows appear to be completely independent, separate physical entities. They measure the vast, two-dimensional distance between the dark circles on their wall, and confidently conclude that they are deeply isolated objects, governed by the local rules of their flat reality. But suddenly, the unseen three-dimensional cylinder rotates. Instantly, simultaneously, both shadows on the wall violently change their shape. The two-dimensional scientists are absolutely terrified by the data. They observe that Shadow A instantly reacted to the exact same stimulus as Shadow B, with zero time delay. They desperately search for a faster-than-light signal, a hidden radio wave traveling across the flat surface of their wall to explain this spooky action at a distance. They build massive two-dimensional particle accelerators and formulate complex flat mathematics, completely failing to understand that no signal ever crossed the distance between the shadows. The terrifying truth that the flat scientists simply cannot perceive is that the two shadows were never separate entities to begin with. They are merely two localized, low-dimensional projections of a single, unified, higher-dimensional object. The communication did not travel across the wall because the true source of the phenomenon exists in a dimension completely outside of the wall's geometry. We are the scientists on the wall. The entire observable universe, every blazing star, every swirling galaxy, every microscopic cell in your own body, and the vast, freezing millions of light-years of empty vacuum separating them all is nothing more than a flattened, three-dimensional shadow cast upon the surface of human perception. When we observe two entangled quantum particles instantly interacting across the cosmic void, we are staring at the shadows of a singular, hyperdimensional geometry. The particles seem to be separated by an insurmountable physical distance, but that separation is an illusion created entirely by the limitations of our 3D prison. In the true, underlying reality, the higher dimensional realm from which the universe is actually projected, those two particles are inextricably bound together. They are tethered to a single, undivided source, a unified quantum state existing in an entirely different architectural layer of the cosmos, where the very concept of physical distance is mathematically meaningless. Try to force your human mind to visualize a realm where distance equals exactly zero. It is an environment completely devoid of traditional geometry, a space where here and there are the exact same point. In this fundamental non-local realm, the entire universe is folded up and superimposed upon itself. Every single atom that makes up the furthest quasar burning at the edge of the observable cosmos is intimately, inextricably touching the atoms that form the firing neurons in your own brain. Space is not a physical void that separates objects. It is simply the conceptual metric of how things are entangled. Things that are heavily entangled appear to our biological interface as being physically close together, forming solid objects, while things that share very little quantum entanglement are projected onto the grid as being millions of light years apart. The vast, terrifying emptiness of the night sky is just a visual representation of quantum correlation, a massive, elaborate hologram generated from a spaceless, timeless void. This realization completely dismantles the physical boundaries of the human experience. If the three-dimensional world is merely a superficial projection, a shadow play cast upon the walls of our evolutionary cave, then we must radically reevaluate the nature of our own existence and the true location of the human mind. We spend our entire lives fiercely identifying with our physical bodies. We believe that our consciousness, our memories, our personalities, and our unique identities are securely locked inside the dense, heavy meat of our brains. We operate under the assumption that we are strictly confined to a specific coordinate in space and a specific, fleeting moment in time. We fear physical death because we are deeply conditioned to believe that when the biological machine finally breaks down and the blood stops flowing, the localized spark of our existence is permanently extinguished in the dark. But if non-locality is the ultimate, governing law of the universe, this materialistic dread is fundamentally misguided. If the basic building blocks of reality can bypass the illusion of space to remain perfectly connected in a higher dimensional field, then the incredibly complex, highly ordered quantum information that generates your waking consciousness might not be restricted to the inside of your skull at all. Your physical body is undeniably trapped within the 3D prison, subject to the relentless decay of entropy, biological aging, and the heavy laws of gravity. But the biological body is just the shadow on the wall. The true source of the shadow, the fundamental code that dictates the unique, vibrating pattern of your mind, might reside entirely in that spaceless, timeless dimension where distance equals zero. The implications are staggering and deeply haunting. It suggests that the essence of who you are is not a fragile, isolated phenomenon generated by chemical reactions in the dark wetness of your head. It suggests that your consciousness is a non-local entity, a complex ripple in a unified quantum field that merely projects its awareness into a biological avatar to temporarily interact with this three-dimensional surface. We are looking at the rigorous scientific framework for for an eternal, indestructible architecture of the self. By proving that space is a localized illusion and that true reality exists outside of the physical grid, quantum mechanics has unwittingly laid the foundation for the ultimate survival of the mind. It forces us to ask where the ghost in the machine actually resides, and whether the destruction of the physical brain is nothing more than the temporary fading of a shadow from the wall, while the hyperdimensional source remains completely untouched by the illusion of death. To fully grasp the magnitude of a universe where space is merely a projected illusion, we must undertake a radical and deeply unsettling dismantling of everything we consider to be physically real. For centuries, human science has been completely hypnotized by the concept of matter. We have meticulously categorized the universe based on its tangible, physical properties. We built massive, subterranean particle accelerators to smash atoms together, desperately hunting for the ultimate, indivisible building blocks of reality. We operated under the firm, intuitive belief that if you dig deep enough into the structure of a star, a mountain, or the dense, grey tissue of the human brain, you will eventually find a microscopic, solid pebble, a fundamental piece of stuff upon which all of existence is constructed. But as our instruments grew sharper and our mathematics became more terrifyingly precise, the universe played a devastating trick on us. When physicists finally peeled back the last layer of the subatomic onion, they did not find a solid pebble. They found absolutely nothing physical at all. They found fluctuating fields of probability, vibrating strings of energy, and ghostly mathematical values. They discovered that matter, the heavy, comforting substance that makes up our bodies and our world, is entirely secondary. It is a byproduct. The true fundamental substance of the universe is not matter, and it is not energy. It is information. This paradigm shift represents the deepest philosophical earthquake in the history of modern physics. Prominent theoretical physicists, echoing the famous assertion of John Archibald Wheeler's "it" from bit, now propose that the cosmos is not a collection of objects, but rather a colossal, infinitely complex quantum computer. In this framework, an atom is not a tiny billiard ball. It is a localized packet of data. The mass, the electrical charge, the quantum spin, and the velocity of an electron are not physical attributes attached to a tiny sphere. They are binary code. They are the exact, unalterable variables written into the operating system of reality. The physical world we see, touch, and interact with is merely the user interface, the graphical projection of this underlying, invisible data stream. Matter is completely disposable and entirely interchangeable. A single carbon atom sitting in the dark, frozen center of a dead comet hurtling through the Oort cloud is absolutely identical in every conceivable way to a carbon atom currently pumping through the warm blood in your heart. There is no physical difference. The only thing that distinguishes the dead matter in the void from the living tissue in your body is the specific, highly ordered arrangement, the architecture, and the precise sequence of the code. The universe is a theater of information, and the physical matter is just the temporary, biological hardware utilized to process it. Understanding this forces us to confront one of the most absolute, unbreakable, and fiercely defended laws in all of quantum mechanics: the conservation of information. We are all familiar with the classical thermodynamic law that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. But modern physics has a much deeper, far more sacred rule: the fundamental quantum information that describes the exact, precise state of any system in the universe can never, under any circumstances, be truly deleted. The cosmos is an absolute, meticulous bookkeeper, and it never suffers from amnesia. To understand the rigidity of this law, consider the act of burning a handwritten journal. In the macroscopic, human world, when you set fire to a book, you believe the words, the thoughts, and the specific information contained on those pages are permanently destroyed, reduced to meaningless ash and smoke. But to the universe, the information is not gone, it is merely scrambled. If you possessed a theoretical supercomputer powerful enough to track the exact trajectory, quantum state, and thermal energy of every single microscopic molecule of smoke, every photon of light emitted by the flame, and every flake of ash drifting in the wind, you could run the mathematical equations in reverse. You could flawlessly reconstruct the exact text of the journal from the chaotic debris. The universe remembers everything. Even if an object is swallowed by the crushing, inescapable gravity of a supermassive black hole, theoretical physicists fiercely debate the mechanisms of exactly how that information survives, because the alternative, the true deletion of quantum data, would completely shatter the foundational mathematics of reality itself. If the universe is constructed entirely of immortal information, and physical matter is nothing more than a temporary, interchangeable vessel, we must look directly into the mirror and ask a terrifying question about the human condition. What exactly are you? You are biologically conditioned to believe that you are your body. You identify with the flesh, the bone, and the specific facial features reflected in the glass. But this is a chemical delusion. From a purely biological standpoint, the physical hardware of your body is constantly dying and being discarded. The cells lining your stomach are entirely replaced every few days. Your skin is shed and regenerated over weeks. Even the heavy, dense calcium in your skeleton is completely turned over and replaced every decade. You are not the same physical matter you were 10 years ago. Almost every single atom that was present in your body during your childhood has long since been exhaled into the atmosphere, flushed into the ocean, or buried in the dirt. Yet, despite the complete and total physical destruction and replacement of your biological hardware, your subjective sense of self, your deeply held memories, and your unique personality remain intact and continuous. You survive the continuous death of your physical matter because you are not the matter. You are the specific, impossibly complex, and highly sustained pattern of quantum information running through the neural network of your brain. You are a highly organized, localized pocket of data, a specific sequence of biological software executing commands within the physical wetware of your skull. Your hopes, your terrifying nightmares, the memory of your first love, and the specific way you perceive the color blue are not physical objects. They are complex arrangements of quantum states, a symphony of information vibrating within the microscopic, architectural scaffolding of your neurons. You are the code. This realization leads us to the ultimate, inevitable confrontation with biological death. In the classical, materialistic view of the world, death is the absolute, terrifying end. When the heart stops beating, when the oxygen supply is cut off, and the electrical grid of the brain permanently powers down, the biological hardware suffers a catastrophic, unrecoverable failure. The intricate electrochemical bonds that held the brain together dissolve back into the chaotic entropy of the earth. If you believe that your consciousness is merely a byproduct of the physical hardware, then the destruction of the brain means the absolute, permanent deletion of the self. It means your identity is a temporary chemical glitch that is violently erased by the cold mechanics of nature. But if we apply the absolute, mathematically rigorous laws of quantum mechanics to the concept of the self, a very different and far more haunting picture emerges. The biological hardware of the brain absolutely fails and rots away, returning its borrowed carbon and water to the Earth. But what happens to the software? What happens to the impossibly complex, deeply entangled quantum pattern that encoded your entire subjective existence? The ironclad law of the conservation of information completely forbids its deletion. The specific, unique arrangement of quantum states that made you who you are cannot be violently erased from the cosmic ledger simply because the fleshy computer processing it lost power. It is mathematically illegal for the universe to forget you. If the fundamental fabric of reality is non-local, as we discovered with Bell's theorem, and if space and distance are merely localized illusions, then the quantum information constituting your consciousness was never truly trapped inside the physical prison of your skull to begin with. The destruction of the biological brain does not delete the code. It merely breaks the fragile, physical receiver that anchored that code to our specific, three-dimensional projection. As the biological machine powers down and the illusion of physical space falls away, the highly ordered, immortal quantum information of your identity is uncoupled from the decaying meat. It is released, completely intact and mathematically preserved, back into the underlying, higher dimensional, non-local field. The software survives the destruction of the hardware. The code of your existence is fundamentally indestructible, outliving the fragile biological avatar and stepping out of the broken machine to reside in a spaceless, timeless dimension where the physical concept of death has absolutely no jurisdiction. If we are to accept that the fundamental code of human identity cannot be destroyed, and that the fabric of the universe is a non-local projection where distance is an illusion, we must inevitably turn our attention to the physical anchor that currently traps us in this three-dimensional prison. We must dissect the biological supercomputer resting inside the dark, bone vault of your skull. For generations, traditional neuroscience has operated under a very strict, materialistic dogma. It views the human brain as a spectacular, albeit purely classical, meat machine. According to the standard biological model, consciousness, the profound, subjective experience of being alive, the terrifying weight of grief, the perception of the color red, and the silent, internal voice currently reading these words is nothing more than a highly complex chemical illusion. It is described as an emergent property, a coincidental byproduct generated by the rapid, chaotic firing of 86 billion neurons communicating through chemical synapses. In this cold, mechanistic view, your mind is basically a wet, sophisticated calculator. When enough electrical sparks jump across enough synapses, the system simply becomes so incredibly complex that it somehow, magically, wakes up and begins to experience the world. But this materialistic assumption harbors a catastrophic logical flaw, a gaping intellectual void that philosophers and physicists refer to as the hard problem of consciousness. No matter how perfectly we map the human brain, no matter how precisely we track the flow of sodium and potassium ions across a cellular membrane or measure the electrical voltage of a firing axon, we cannot find a single, logical mechanism that explains how unconscious chemical reactions transform into subjective feeling. You can build a supercomputer the size of a city, wire it with trillions of complex silicon pathways, and program it to process information 1 billion times faster than the human mind, but that machine will never feel the existential dread of its own mortality. It will never truly experience the beauty of a dying star. It is just processing data in the dark. The sheer, terrifying reality is that classical physics and traditional biology are fundamentally incapable of explaining why the lights are on inside your head. If consciousness is just complex computing, there is no physical reason why we shouldn't all be highly functional, biological zombies, processing our environments without any internal, subjective awareness whatsoever. To solve the ultimate mystery of the ghost in the machine, we have to completely abandon the macro-scale biology of the brain and descend into a microscopic realm where the traditional laws of chemistry violently break down. In the 1990s, a brilliant, heretical alliance was formed between two men who decided to approach the mystery of the mind from completely different scientific extremes. Sir Roger Penrose, a towering mathematical physicist and future Nobel laureate who had spent his career mapping the crushing singularities of black holes alongside Stephen Hawking, teamed up with Dr. Stuart Hameroff, a prominent anesthesiologist who spent his life studying the exact chemical mechanisms that turn human consciousness off. Together, they proposed a theory so radical, so deeply unsettling to the scientific establishment, that it sparked a decades-long academic war. Their framework is known as orchestrated objective reduction, or the Orch-OR theory. Penrose and Hameroff forcefully argued that looking at the firing synapses between neurons to find the source of consciousness is like looking at the electrical cords of a television set to find the broadcasting station. The neuron is simply too massive, too slow, and too classical to be the true generator of the mind. They theorized that to find the actual seat of the human soul, we must look much, much deeper. We must look inside the neuron itself, bypassing the macroscopic chemical sparks, and zoom in on the microscopic structural scaffolding that holds the cell together. Deep within the liquid cytoplasm of every single neuron in your brain lies a dense, incredibly complex network of microscopic protein tubes known as microtubules. For decades, biologists dismissed these structures as nothing more than the rigid, biological skeleton of the cell, a passive conveyor belt used to transport molecules and provide structural support. But Hameroff, having observed how anesthesia perfectly targets these specific proteins to magically erase human awareness, realized they were hiding a profound secret. Microtubules are constructed from highly symmetrical, repeating lattices of a protein called tubulin. The architecture of these microscopic tubes is so perfect, so mathematically precise, that it borders on the unnatural. Penrose and Hameroff looked at the crystalline lattice structure of the microtubule and realized it was not just a biological support beam, it was a subatomic isolation chamber. The physical dimensions of the tubulin proteins within the microtubule are so infinitesimally small that they cross the absolute threshold into the quantum realm. They are small enough to host, maintain, and manipulate delicate quantum states, completely shielding them from the warm, wet, and chaotic thermal noise of the surrounding biological brain. According to the Orch-OR theory, inside the microscopic darkness of these microtubules, the fundamental rules of reality are completely rewritten. The electrons within the tubulin proteins do not behave like solid objects. They enter a state of quantum superposition, effectively existing in multiple states and multiple physical locations simultaneously. Because the microtubules are densely networked across the entire brain, these quantum states become deeply entangled, forming a massive, unified, brain-wide quantum wave. Your brain is essentially operating a biological quantum computer, but the terrifying genius of Penrose's theory lies in what happens next. Penrose mathematically proved that a quantum superposition is inherently unstable. It is literally a microscopic tear in the fabric of space-time. When the quantum wave inside the microtubules builds up enough mass and energy, the universe can no longer tolerate the geometric paradox. The fabric of reality forcefully snaps back into place, causing the quantum wave to violently, spontaneously collapse. Penrose called this geometric collapse objective reduction, and it is in this exact infinitesimal fraction of a yoctosecond, the exact moment the quantum wave collapses, that a single, discrete moment of conscious awareness is forged. Consciousness is not a continuous, flowing stream. It is a rapid, staccato sequence of millions of microscopic quantum collapses happening inside your microtubules every single second, stringing together to create the seamless illusion of a continuous reality. But the absolute, most staggering implication of the Orch-OR theory is the origin of the information itself. If the brain relies on the collapse of quantum wave functions to generate awareness, it means the brain is directly, mechanically tethered to the fundamental, non-local quantum field of the universe. The microtubules are not creating the information out of dead chemical matter. They are acting as highly tuned, biological resonators. They are microscopic antennas. Just as a television set does not generate the news broadcast, but merely captures an invisible electromagnetic frequency and translates it into light and sound, your brain does not generate your consciousness. The fundamental, raw material of consciousness, the proto-conscious information, is deeply embedded in the very geometry of the universe itself. It exists everywhere, at all times, in the spaceless, timeless void we discovered through Bell's theorem. The microscopic tubes inside your neurons are simply the biological hardware that evolved to tune into this specific cosmic frequency. Your brain is receiving the signal of your identity from the non-local void and translating it into a localized, three-dimensional experience. If this highly controversial, reality-bending theory is true, it definitively answers the ultimate question of our investigation. If the brain is merely a biological antenna receiving a quantum signal from a dimension where physical distance and time do not exist, then the inevitable destruction of that antenna has absolutely no effect on the eternal broadcast of the soul. The biological machine will fail, the microtubules will rot, and the connection to the three-dimensional grid will be severed. But the fundamental, non-local signal of who you are will simply continue to vibrate in the absolute dark, perfectly intact, waiting for the next receiver to power on. If we are to seriously entertain the profound, reality-breaking implications of the orchestrated objective reduction theory, the terrifying proposition that the human brain is not a localized generator of consciousness, but rather a highly evolved biological antenna tuned to a non-local quantum field, we must eventually confront the ultimate test of this biological hardware. We must examine what happens when the machine violently breaks down. In the traditional, materialistic framework of neuroscience, the mind is viewed entirely as the byproduct of biological functioning. It is the hum of the engine. Therefore, when the engine begins to fail, the hum should sputter, distort, and eventually grind to a chaotic halt. A dying brain, starved of oxygen and suffering from catastrophic cellular collapse, should logically produce a dying, deeply fragmented, and heavily distorted consciousness. As the physical structure rots, the mind should plunge into confusion, darkness, and senseless hallucination. But when we look closely at the extreme limits of human medical data, specifically at the boundary line where life violently bleeds into death, we discover a series of clinical anomalies that completely defy this materialistic logic. We find experimental, observable glitches in the matrix. We find moments where the biological hardware is demonstrably, irreparably broken, yet the software of the human mind suddenly operates with a terrifying, impossible clarity. The most prominent and rigorously studied of these anomalies is the near-death experience. For decades, the scientific establishment lazily dismissed these reports as nothing more than the chaotic, drug-induced hallucinations of a dying brain, a final, desperate surge of neurochemicals flooding the visual cortex as the physical body fights for its life. But modern resuscitation medicine has forced a chilling re-evaluation of that dismissive stance. Consider the clinical reality of a patient suffering from full cardiac arrest. When the heart stops pumping, blood pressure drops to zero. Within seconds, the brain is entirely starved of the oxygen and glucose it absolutely requires to function. In less than 20 seconds, the electroencephalogram, the machine designed to measure the electrical sparks of consciousness flickering across the cerebral cortex, flatlines. It registers absolute, dead silence. There are no action potentials, no firing synapses, and no macroscopic chemical reactions capable of generating a cohesive thought, let alone a complex, hyper-vivid narrative. By every known law of classical biology, the mind must be completely annihilated in this state. The biological projector has been violently unplugged from the wall. Yet, millions of patients dragged back from this state of clinical, measurable death report experiences that are not chaotic, blurry, or fragmented. They report a level of sensory perception, cognitive clarity, and emotional lucidity that vastly supersedes anything they have ever felt in their normal, waking lives. They describe the sensation of their conscious awareness violently detaching from the heavy, suffocating meat of their bodies. They report floating near the ceiling of the operating room, calmly watching the frantic medical staff attempting to resuscitate their lifeless biological shells. In highly documented, terrifyingly specific cases, these clinically dead patients are able to accurately recall the specific conversations of the surgeons, the exact surgical instruments used, and the hidden details of the room that they could not possibly have seen from the vantage point of the operating table, even if their eyes had been open. If the brain is the sole generator of the mind, a flatlined brain producing a hyperlucid, omniscient, out-of-body experience is a physical impossibility. It is the equivalent of a completely shattered, unplugged television set, suddenly broadcasting a live, high-definition broadcast in 8K resolution. However, if we view this medical glitch through the lens of quantum non-locality and the Orch-OR theory, the impossible suddenly becomes mechanically logical. If the microtubules inside the neurons are acting as microscopic quantum isolation chambers, holding the entangled information of the self, what happens when the biological environment collapses? As the brain dies and the cellular scaffolding begins to degrade, the quantum states housed within those microtubules do not simply vanish into nothingness. Because the fundamental laws of physics dictate that quantum information cannot be destroyed. Instead, the quantum information of the soul simply uncouples from the dying biological hardware. It leaks out of the collapsing 3D biological interface and expands back into the vast, unified, non-local field from which it originated. The tether is severed. The out-of-body experience is not a hallucination generated by a broken machine. It is the exact, literal sensation of the conscious software being forcefully liberated from its biological prison, existing entirely independently of the sensory organs that usually confine it. This terrifying concept of software independence is further validated by an even more haunting medical phenomenon known as terminal lucidity. To understand the gravity of this glitch, we must look at the cruel, unyielding progression of severe neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's or advanced dementia. Over the course of years, these diseases physically ravage the brain. They are not merely chemical imbalances, they are the literal, physical destruction of brain tissue. Toxic proteins build up, neurons choke and die, and the highly complex networks responsible for memory, personality, and facial recognition are permanently, physically dissolved into dark, empty voids within the skull. The hard drive is shattered. The patient is reduced to an unresponsive, vacant shell, completely disconnected from their past and their loved ones, unable to form a single cohesive sentence for months or even years. The biological architecture required to produce their identity simply no longer exists. Yet, in a staggering number of clinically recorded cases, usually occurring just hours or days before physical death, these severely brain-damaged patients suddenly and inexplicably wake up. The thick, suffocating fog lifts. They sit up in their hospice beds, their eyes lock into focus, and they begin to speak with perfect, unblemished clarity. They recognize the faces of their weeping children. They recall complex memories from decades past, and they express profound, articulate farewells. They are completely, undeniably themselves again. How is this physically possible? If memories and personality are stored strictly within the physical connections of the neural network, then a brain heavily eaten away by Alzheimer's should never be able to temporarily regenerate those connections. You cannot retrieve a file from a computer hard drive that has been physically smashed with a hammer. But if the brain is merely an antenna, terminal lucidity is not a medical miracle. It is a final, violent calibration of the signal before the receiver breaks forever. The memories and the personality of the patient were never exclusively stored in the rotting biological tissue. The tissue was simply the localized router designed to download the specific quantum pattern of their identity from the non-local universe. As the physical body prepares for imminent biological shutdown, the dense, heavy chemical filters that usually restrict and confine our consciousness begin to catastrophically fail. The veil thins. As the final biological tethers snap, the underlying, immortal quantum signal of the mind is able to briefly, powerfully assert itself one last time, bypassing the physically destroyed memory centers of the biological hard drive and drawing its pristine, uncorrupted identity directly from the non-local information field. The sudden flash of absolute clarity is the brilliant burning flare of the quantum signal detaching from the dying meat. To grasp the reality of this transition, we must return to the metaphor of the radio. Imagine an old, complex, wooden radio sitting on a table, perfectly tuned to receive a beautiful sweeping symphony. As long as the physical components of the radio, the copper wires, the glass vacuum tubes, the paper speaker cones remain intact, the music fills the room. But what happens if you take a heavy iron hammer and violently smash that radio to pieces? The glass shatters, the wires are ripped apart, and the wooden chassis is reduced to splinters. The music instantly stops. To the localized, biological observer standing in the room, it appears as though the song has been permanently destroyed. But have you actually destroyed the music? Have you killed the symphony? Absolutely not. The destruction of the physical box on the table had absolutely no effect whatsoever on the invisible electromagnetic frequency vibrating through the atmosphere. The signal of the music continues to broadcast flawlessly, radiating out through the void, completely indifferent to the violent death of the localized receiver. Death is merely the shattering of the radio. The complex, highly ordered quantum information that constitutes your unique identity, your memories, and the very essence of your consciousness does not die with the flesh. It simply ceases to manifest in this specific three-dimensional coordinate. Unburdened by the broken machinery of the skull, the signal of your existence continues to vibrate perfectly in the deep, non-local dark, eternal and completely untouchable by the decay of the physical world. To understand the ultimate destination of the human mind after the biological hardware fails, we must first trace the origin of the signal itself. If the brain is merely a highly evolved, microscopic quantum antenna receiving a broadcast from a non-local dimension, we are forced to ask where that broadcast is actually coming from. We must look far beyond the fragile confines of the human skull, past the decaying hospital beds, and look out into the terrifying, freezing abyss of the cosmos. But looking at the universe as it exists today is completely insufficient. The vast, empty voids separating the sprawling galaxies and the billions of light-years of cold, dead space are merely the localized illusions of our current three-dimensional projection. To discover the true nature of the conscious signal vibrating within your neurons, we must rewind the clock. We must drag the entire physical universe backward through time, collapsing the sprawling architecture of reality into a single, terrifying moment of absolute creation. We must return to the primordial violence of the Big Bang. When you picture the birth of the universe, your biologically constrained imagination likely visualizes a colossal explosion of light and matter, expanding outward into a pre-existing, empty darkness. This is a fundamental, macroscopic misconception. The Big Bang was not an explosion that happened inside of space. It was the violent, explosive creation of space itself. Before that exact infinitesimal fraction of a yoctosecond, roughly 13.8 billion years ago, there was no empty void waiting to be filled. There was no concept of distance, no measurement of time, and no three-dimensional grid. Every single physical component that currently constitutes the observable universe was violently crushed into a space infinitely smaller than the microscopic nucleus of a single atom. Every blazing star, every swirling nebula, every massive black hole, and every single subatomic particle that would eventually cool and coalesce to form the heavy iron in your blood and the calcium in your bones was compacted into a single, dimensionless mathematical point. Physicists call this the singularity. It was an environment of such unimaginable density and incomprehensible temperature that the fundamental laws of physics, gravity, and quantum mechanics completely broke down and merged into a single, chaotic scream of pure energy. But the most profound and reality-breaking implication of the singularity is not its heat or its density. It is the absolute, terrifying geometry of its existence. Because every single piece of matter and energy in the cosmos was crushed into a mathematical point that possessed absolutely zero physical volume, distance did not exist. At the exact moment of creation, every single fundamental particle in the universe was occupying the exact same location. Every quark, every photon, and every electron was in direct, intimate, physical contact with every other particle in existence. There was no separation. There was no empty space to divide them. Now, we must apply the absolute, rigorous laws of quantum mechanics to this primordial state. As we have already established, when two subatomic particles interact closely with one another, their individual quantum states merge. They become inextricably entangled, sharing a single, unified identity that completely ignores the boundaries of physical space. If physical interaction and close proximity are the absolute requirements for quantum entanglement, then the singularity represents the ultimate, unbreakable, subatomic marriage. In that infinite compression, every single particle in the universe interacted with every other particle simultaneously. The entire cosmos, in its absolute entirety, was entangled. It was forged as a single, flawless, unified quantum system. When the Big Bang finally detonated, and the fabric of space-time violently inflated, driving matter outward at terrifying speeds to create the sprawling, freezing cosmos we see today. The physical distances between the particles grew to incomprehensible proportions. The atoms that would eventually form your physical body were thrown billions of light years away from the atoms that currently burn in the heart of the Andromeda galaxy. But as we learned from Bell's theorem, the expansion of physical space is nothing more than the stretching of a three-dimensional holographic projection. Distance is a localized illusion. The stretching of the 3D grid does not, and mathematically cannot, sever the underlying quantum tether. The terrifying, beautiful truth of our reality is that the primordial entanglement was never broken. The universe is not a collection of isolated, dead rocks and lonely clouds of burning gas floating blindly in the dark. It is a single, unimaginably vast, vibrating web of quantum information. At the deepest, non-local level of reality, every single atom inside your brain remains fundamentally, mathematically, and intimately entangled with the furthest edges of the observable void. This concept of primordial entanglement completely obliterates the greatest philosophical and biological illusion humanity has ever suffered, the illusion of the isolated self. You are biologically programmed to feel utterly alone in the universe. Your evolutionary hardware constructs a rigid boundary at the edge of your skin, telling you that you are a completely separate, independent entity, a lonely spark of consciousness navigating a cold, dead, and indifferent physical world. You look up at the night sky and feel a profound, crushing sense of cosmic insignificance, believing that the universe is a massive, empty room and you are nothing more than a temporary, biological accident occurring in a dark corner. But this feeling of isolation is a biological hallucination. It is a necessary trick of the 3D prison, designed to keep your physical avatar focused on survival, eating, and reproducing on the macroscopic surface of the Earth. When we combine the concept of primordial entanglement with the Orch-OR theory of the quantum brain, a completely different, profoundly majestic architecture of consciousness begins to emerge. If your brain is a quantum antenna utilizing the microscopic structures of its microtubules to tune into a non-local signal, and if the entire universe is a single, deeply entangled quantum field forged at the exact moment of the Big Bang, then the signal your brain is receiving is not a lonely, individual broadcast. Your consciousness is not an isolated, separate soul magically inserted into a biological machine. It is a localized ripple in a single, universal ocean of awareness. Think of the vast, rolling surface of a deep ocean. When the wind blows and the energy shifts, a wave rises upon the water. For a brief, fleeting moment, that wave appears to be an individual, distinct entity. It has a specific height, a specific speed, and a specific physical location as it moves toward the shore. If that wave possessed a localized biological consciousness, it might look at the surrounding water and believe it was entirely separate from the ocean, fighting its own lonely battle against the tide. But the wave is not separate. It has no independent existence. It is merely a temporary, localized expression of the entire ocean's energy, rising up for a fleeting second before inevitably crashing and folding back into the vast, undivided whole. The water is never lost. It simply returns to its natural, resting state. You are the wave. Your ego, your specific personality, and your subjective sense of being an isolated individual are simply the temporary, localized expressions of a universal quantum field experiencing itself through the complex, biological geometry of a human brain. The universe is not dead and it is not silent. It is a single, massively entangled, hyperdimensional nervous system, and we are its sensory organs. We are the mechanism by which the cosmos wakes up, opens its biological eyes, and looks back at itself in a shattered, kaleidoscopic myriad of temporary perspectives. Every joy you feel, every terrifying grief you endure, and every profound realization you achieve is actually the universe itself processing information through your specific, localized biological node. This changes everything we understand about the concept of life, death, and existential loneliness. You have never been alone, because the very concept of you as a separate entity is a mathematical impossibility. You are technically, physically, and fundamentally entangled with the entire cosmos. The fundamental code of your existence is written into the same overarching quantum fabric that dictates the swirling of the galaxies and the burning of the stars. When the biological hardware of your brain finally fails, and the physical microtubules inside your neurons decay, the illusion of your separation simply ends. The localized ripple flattens out. The signal of your consciousness does not vanish into a dark, empty void, nor does it travel to some mythical, separate realm. It is forcefully uncoupled from the 3D projection and smoothly, perfectly reabsorbed into the primordial entanglement from which it was temporarily drawn. Death is not the extinguishing of the soul, it is the ultimate, magnificent reunion. It is the exact moment the localized illusion shatters, allowing the tiny, isolated spark of your human awareness to seamlessly dissolve back into the blinding, infinite, and eternal consciousness of the universe itself. The profound realization that the universe is a single, deeply entangled quantum field, and that the isolated human soul is merely a localized ripple in a cosmic ocean of awareness, is a deeply spiritual, almost comforting philosophical awakening. But human history is not driven by spiritual awakenings. It is driven by a dark, relentless, and unyielding desire for power, control, and absolute strategic supremacy. Whenever humanity uncovers a fundamental, terrifying truth about the architecture of reality, we do not simply sit back in quiet contemplation. We immediately look for a way to build a cage around it, harness its power, and turn it into a weapon. The discovery of the atom gave us the power to obliterate entire cities in a fraction of a second. The mastery of aerodynamics gave us supersonic fighter jets that can deliver death from the stratosphere. But all of our traditional military technology, from the most advanced stealth bombers hiding in the radar shadows to the deepest nuclear submarines prowling the ocean floor, is fundamentally constrained by the laws of classical physics. They are heavily bound by the tyranny of physical space, the speed of sound, and the absolute speed limit of light. But if the fundamental fabric of reality is non-local, and if distance is mathematically proven to be a localized illusion, the global military-industrial complex has realized that the ultimate strategic high ground is no longer the sky or the orbit of the Earth. The ultimate high ground is the quantum void. We have officially entered an era where the most powerful nations on the planet are actively racing to weaponize the ghost. This terrifying new arms race is not being fought with uranium or physical ballistics, but with pure, entangled information. The immediate, tactical application of quantum non-locality is currently manifesting in the aggressive development of a global, unhackable quantum internet. For decades, military intelligence and global espionage have relied on complex mathematical algorithms to encrypt their most sensitive communications. But any classical code, no matter how sophisticated, can eventually be broken by a powerful enough supercomputer. Quantum communication, however, completely bypasses the vulnerabilities of physical transmission. By utilizing pairs of entangled photons, military agencies can create a direct, non-local cryptographic tether between 2 points on the globe. If a commander in a subterranean bunker wants to send a nuclear launch code to a stealth fleet operating in the ocean, they do not beam a radio signal that can be intercepted. They use the entangled particles. Because these particles share a single unified quantum state, any attempt by an enemy spy to intercept, measure, or listen in on the transmission will immediately and violently force the delicate quantum wave function to collapse. The mere act of observation actively destroys the information. The legitimate receiver instantly knows the line has been compromised because the entangled link is severed. It is a communication network protected not by human mathematics, but by the absolute, inviolable laws of physics. The development of quantum radar and entangled communication networks guarantees a future where absolute, perfect secrecy is a weapon possessed only by those who have mastered the subatomic void. But secure communication is merely the shallow, tactical surface of this terrifying technology. The true, reality-breaking application of non-locality lies in a process known as quantum teleportation. When you hear the word teleportation, your mind likely jumps to classical science fiction, imagining a machine that physically dematerializes a solid object, shoots its atoms across space like a beam of light, and reassembles it on the other side. That is a macroscopic fantasy. Quantum teleportation is far stranger, far darker, and completely real. It has already been successfully demonstrated in laboratories across the world and beamed from the Earth to orbiting satellites in the freezing vacuum of space. Physicists are not physically moving a particle from point A to point B. The physical matter itself is irrelevant. What they are actually doing is teleporting the pure, fundamental quantum information, the true essence of the particle. They take a particle in a laboratory and they force it to interact with one half of an entangled pair. Through a highly complex mathematical operation, they scan the exact, complete quantum state of the target particle. But the universe enforces a brutal, non-negotiable law known as the no-cloning theorem. It is mathematically impossible to create a perfect, identical copy of an unknown quantum state without completely destroying the original. Therefore, the very act of scanning the target particle completely annihilates its original quantum information. It is violently erased from its physical location. But instantly, with zero time delay, that exact, flawless quantum state is recreated in the other entangled particle, which could be sitting in a laboratory on the other side of the planet. The physical matter did not move, but the absolute identity, the fundamental code of the particle, jumped the physical gap entirely outside the bounds of space and time. If we follow this proven, physical reality to its absolute, logical extreme, we must cross a terrifying, ethical, and existential threshold. If the universe operates on a fundamental level of information, and if human consciousness, the complex pattern of your memories, your personality, and your subjective awareness is ultimately just an impossibly intricate arrangement of quantum states held within the microscopic scaffolding of your biological brain, then your mind is subject to the exact same laws of physics as a single photon. You are just a massive, localized file of quantum data. As our quantum supercomputers become exponentially more powerful, and our ability to map the neural and subatomic architecture of the human brain approaches perfection, the ultimate military and technological objective becomes clear. We are not just building machines to calculate variables. We are building the architecture required to teleport the human mind. Imagine a machine capable of reading the total, holistic quantum state of a human brain. To perfectly capture the code of who you are, the machine would have to enforce the no-cloning theorem. The scanning process would violently, instantly destroy the original biological brain. Your physical body would be annihilated, left as an empty, dead shell of carbon and water. But in that exact same yoctosecond, the total, uncorrupted quantum pattern of your consciousness would be perfectly reconstructed inside a highly advanced, supercooled quantum receiver located thousands of miles away. This is the dawn of the digitized, weaponized soul. Imagine the terrifying implications for global warfare and human survival. We are looking at a future where the concept of physical human vulnerability is completely eradicated. A military superpower would no longer need to send fragile, biological human beings into the chaotic meat grinder of a physical battlefield. The minds of their most elite tacticians, pilots, and operatives would not reside in human skulls. Their consciousness, the very essence of their identity, would be uploaded and permanently backed up on massive, heavily shielded quantum servers buried deep within impenetrable, subterranean bunkers. From this secure, non-local void, their minds could be instantly teleported into heavily armored, synthetic, robotic avatars operating on the front lines, or beamed directly into the orbital targeting systems of autonomous drone swarms. If the synthetic avatar is destroyed in combat, the mind does not die. The physical machine is reduced to burning scrap metal, but the quantum pattern is instantly beamed back to the server, perfectly intact, ready to be downloaded into a new physical vessel. We are hurtling toward a horizon where humanity violently detaches its existence from the biological evolutionary chain. We are learning how to manually extract the ghost from the machine and store it in the cold, perfect architecture of the quantum realm. The human soul, once considered a fragile, divine spark tethered to a dying animal body, is rapidly becoming the ultimate piece of military software. It is a sequence of indestructible quantum code that can be copied, teleported, encrypted, and weaponized across the entire span of the globe without ever physically crossing a single inch of physical space. By mastering the illusion of distance and the non-local mechanics of the cosmos, we are not just exploring the universe. We are actively engineering our own terrifying immortality, ensuring that long after our fragile biology has turned to dust, our minds will continue to hum endlessly within the freezing, immortal servers of a spaceless reality. As we step back from the terrifying, weaponized frontiers of the quantum internet and the dizzying medical anomalies of the dying brain, we are forced to look at our own reflections with a completely shattered understanding of what it means to exist. The journey we have taken tonight through the absolute darkest, most confounding depths of modern physics has not merely tweaked our understanding of the cosmos. It has completely annihilated the foundation upon which human sanity is built. We began by observing two microscopic particles perfectly mimicking each other across the frozen, infinite expanse of the observable universe, completely ignoring the absolute speed limit of light. We watched as Albert Einstein, the grand architect of space and time, desperately tried to defend the comforting, logical boundaries of local realism, only to have his intellectual cathedral entirely dismantled by the unforgiving mathematics of John Bell. We have seen the absolute proof that the universe is not a collection of isolated, separate objects floating in a dead, empty void. Instead, the void itself is a lie. The concept of physical distance, the yawning chasms between the galaxies, and the empty space separating your eyes from this screen are nothing more than a highly convincing, biologically necessary hallucination. Non-locality is not a subatomic glitch. It is the true, absolute, and undivided operating system of the universe, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that the here and now is a shallow, localized facade. When you look down at your own hands, when you feel the heavy, undeniable pull of gravity anchoring your feet to the floor, and when you listen to the rhythmic, mechanical beating of your own heart, you are experiencing the ultimate evolutionary masterpiece of deception. You are completely hypnotized by the physical world. For your entire life, you have been fiercely conditioned to identify strictly with the meat, the bone, and the chemical reactions sparking within the dark, wet vault of your skull. You believe that you are a physical creature born into a harsh, three-dimensional grid, subject to the cruel, unyielding arrow of time and the inevitable decay of entropy. But the rigorous, undeniable laws of quantum mechanics, the very laws that power the stars and dictate the fundamental structure of reality, aggressively suggest otherwise. If the physical universe is merely a holographic projection cast from a deeper, higher dimensional realm where distance equals zero, and if the true, fundamental substance of reality is immortal quantum information, then your physical body is not your true identity. You are not a biological organism that somehow miraculously generated a conscious mind. You are a highly complex, non-local ripple of quantum information that is temporarily wearing a three-dimensional suit of atoms. Think of your biological body, the lungs, the nervous system, the sensory organs, and the incredibly complex array of quantum-sensitive microtubules inside your brain as a highly sophisticated, biological diving suit. If you want to explore the crushing, freezing depths of the Marianas Trench, you cannot simply hold your breath and dive into the abyss. You must encase yourself in a heavy, pressurized titanium sphere. You must look out through thick, distorted glass portals to interact with a high-pressure environment that is completely alien to your natural state. Your physical body is exactly that heavy, pressurized sphere. It is a biological drone, an avatar meticulously engineered over billions of years of savage evolution to allow your fundamental, non-local consciousness to temporarily interact with the harsh, low-dimensional surface of the physical world. You are actively projecting your awareness into this localized coordinate, using the eyes to capture photons of light and the ears to capture vibrations of air, simply because the underlying quantum code of your identity requires a physical interface to experience the heavy, linear drag of time. But the diving suit is not the diver, the drone is not the pilot, and the biological hardware is entirely distinct from the immortal software it is currently running. This profound realization completely dismantles our deeply ingrained biological terror of death. We mourn the dying, and we fear our own eventual demise because we have entirely confused the destruction of the diving suit with the destruction of the diver. In the cold, materialistic view of the universe, the cessation of brain activity is the absolute, permanent deletion of the self. But the universe is governed by the ironclad law of information conservation, the impossibly intricate, beautifully entangled quantum pattern that encodes your memories, your subjective fears, your deepest loves, and the exact, unique frequency of your awareness cannot be violently erased from the cosmic ledger simply because the biological machinery failed. It is mathematically illegal for reality to delete you. When the heart finally stops, when the oxygen is cut off, and the physical scaffolding of the brain collapses, the localized illusion simply comes to an end. The heavy, pressurized suit is breached, and it falls away, returning its borrowed carbon and calcium to the dirt. But the signal, the true, underlying architecture of your existence remains completely untouched. It smoothly uncouples from the dying biological receiver and effortlessly retreats back into the blinding, unified, non-local field from which it was temporarily drawn. We are not fragile, lonely creatures stumbling through a dark and indifferent physical void. We are native residents of a higher dimensional reality, a timeless, spaceless realm of pure, entangled information. The greatest philosophical mistake humanity ever made was convincing itself that the soul was a mystical, unscientific concept, a religious metaphor completely divorced from the cold, hard equations of physics. Quantum mechanics has forcefully corrected this error. It has provided the rigorous, mathematical framework for the eternal. The soul is not magic. It is the specific, indestructible quantum code of your identity. It forces us to permanently reverse the way we view our own existence. You do not have a soul. You are a soul. You are a soul that currently happens to possess a temporary biological body. And that true, fundamental self exists in the one place in the cosmos where the ticking of the clock and the vast, empty distances of space have absolutely no power over you. You are a permanent, structural component of the universe itself, entangled with the first moments of the Big Bang and destined to outlive the burning out of the final stars. As we power down the instruments and step away from the edge of the quantum abyss tonight, I want you to sit in the quiet darkness of your room and seriously consider the true nature of the thoughts currently echoing inside your head. When you close your eyes and feel the silent, invisible weight of your own awareness, what are you actually feeling? Do you truly believe that your consciousness, your entire subjective universe, is nothing more than a temporary chemical reaction hopelessly trapped inside the physical prison of your skull? Or do you feel the haunting, inescapable truth that your brain is simply a biological antenna receiving a continuous, immortal signal from somewhere entirely outside the boundaries of space and time? I want to know exactly where you think the ghost in your machine comes from. Leave your theories, your existential dread, and your deepest thoughts in the comments below. We have only just begun to scratch the surface of the illusions that bind us to this world. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the dark architecture of reality. Good night, and I will see you in the next video here at Still Science Lab.